Hello, I'm Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice. And here I'm going to talk about what are called the 5 rules for effective writing. Now, in a previous session, I spoke about the 4 rules for writing, and they were my rules for my own 4 rules for making a start, keeping going, and really about the process of writing. And they were, of course, reading the guidelines, counting words, and seeking some criticism of your writing. And the final of my 4 rules is treating every rejection as the beginning of the next submission. So they're really about the process of writing, which is very important, of course. And of course, one of the fundamental rules of writing is that you must write, you must make a start. One of the great faults of people who write is that they don't write, or they don't write often enough. So assuming that you do write, what I want to talk here about are a well-known 5 rules for effective writing. These are not mine. Many people have got sets of rules, but this particular set of rules comes from an author, famous British author and journalist called George Orwell. His real name was Eric Blair, but he wrote under the pseudonym of George Orwell. He's well known for key novels like 1984 about a dystopian world, and Animal Farm about the rise of dictatorships and so forth. He was a political writer and indeed a very, very effective journalist, but he wrote a great many novels too. I don't know if they're available to read in China or not. They may well not be. Anyway, whatever one thinks of George Orwell's views, and I don't agree with them all myself, or whatever one thinks about the things he was writing about, he was a very, very good writer, very easy to read, and he developed these 5 rules for effective writing, which I'm going to share now. Now, the first of these rules, and they don't appear to be in any particular order, and I've referred to some extent to some of this in a previous presentation. But his first rule, I've got them on the screen in front of me here: never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Now, I'll read that again. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. It's not telling you to use things you see in print. Use things that you don't use things that you're used to seeing in print. In other words, don't write as if you're writing newspaper headlines and things like that. Now, metaphors and similes and other figures of speech, idioms and so forth are quite acceptable in academic writing, provided they're appropriate and specifically appropriate to what you're trying to write. But don't borrow phrases from other places. And again, most of you will be considering writing academic papers in a second language, in English, and I have no idea if I'm sure that there are metaphors, for example, in Chinese. I don't know about similes and cliches. There probably are too. But if you are learning English by watching American and possibly English, by English I mean British television and movies, and if you come to the UK and you get to know people and you live amongst them and you hear them speaking and you read newspapers and so forth, which are all excellent ways to learn English, the use of English and how to speak it, and indeed how to write and to read it, some of the things that people say are not suitable for academic writing, and I mentioned some of these before. In fact, they're not suitable for any kind of writing. Try to avoid them. So, for example, we say things, and I refer to some of this in the previous presentation. We say things like, this was swept under the carpet. So, for example, there may be a scandal in a hospital. Patients have died for some unknown reason, and ultimately there's an investigation, but initially it's almost inevitable that in a newspaper reporting it will say something like, and this was swept under the carpet. You pick up the carpet and you sweep it under. Swept under the carpet is a very common phrase in speech, and it's not very helpful in writing. and it's borrowed from elsewhere, and it simply means ignored. So if something has not been dealt with and has been ignored, just say ignored, because that's one word as opposed to swept under the carpet, which is 4, and swept under the carpet, swept under the carpet, 4 words, yes, I have to count them. So you're down to one word, and not everyone will understand what swept under the carpet really means. Especially in days when we don't sweep things up so much, we tend to hoover them. So for example, some of these sayings go out of date, and they also don't transfer well into other languages. So that's a really good example of a sort of cliche, an empty phrase that can be replaced by a single word. We say things, for example, if there are protests or there are countries fighting other countries, we say things like we're standing shoulder to shoulder with them. It just means that we support them. Again, one word, not standing shoulder to shoulder. 4 words replaced by one, and one word which says exactly what you mean to say and you want to say. So try to avoid cliches and common forms of speech. It's actually very, very difficult to do because we do it all the time in conversation. Try to do it though, even though it's hard, and try to invent your own phrases. Try to find your own way of explaining things. There's nothing worse than reading writing that is full of cliches and metaphors that are commonly used. It's a sure sign that the writer isn't confident and has borrowed the phrases from elsewhere. I've spent a long time on that one, and as I say, we referred to it before, but it's very important. You certainly will have things like that edited out by an editor at the end of the process, so you may as well not use them yourself. Now, the next of Orwell's 5 rules is never use a long word where a short one will do. The next point, the third point, is related to that. Again, I referred to this in a previous presentation, but don't strive to look for long or complicated words. Don't say, for example, in English, the word for a car is automobile. There's no need to say automobile. You can simply say car. The word for the device, if you like, that we push little children about in is a pram. The full word is perambulator. You would never do that or never use it, but some people genuinely do try to work in these big, complicated words into their writing, under the impression that they're making their writing more academic, or a more academic style, as I talked about before. No, there's only one style of writing that's acceptable, and that's good style. Anything else is bad style. So the use of long, complicated words is unnecessary. Now, in technical writing like ours, in medicine and in nursing and in healthcare generally, there are a great many complicated terms, of course, and they need to be used properly. But wherever possible, try to explain them. So what I'm saying is, don't deliberately seek to use long words. You may well have to use them on some occasions, that's quite acceptable, but make sure that you always explain what those words are and what they mean. So never use a long word where a short one will do. Simple as that. Try to use short and simple words. Now, again, I've talked about this already, and I'll probably talk about it in the next session. But the third of Orwell's rules for effective writing is, if it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. In other words, less is always better. Always. I do have arguments with some people about this, who say that it's sometimes necessary to use additional words here and there. No, if you can cut a word out, then please remove it. And I will give examples in the next section of specific phrases where it's easy to remove a word. The problem is not using these occasionally. The problem is that people who do use certain phrases tend to use them often. And if a phrase has maybe 5 words instead of 1 or 2, then it adds a great deal to the writing. So always try to get rid of those words, and I'll talk in the next session about specific tactics for getting rid of those words. I won't deal with that at the moment. Now, the fourth of Orwell's rules for effective writing, something that I mentioned already in the previous section, are never use the passive where you can use the active. In other words, don't refer to things as if they're happening. Someone else is doing it. Either make sure that you're doing it, or you make sure that you identify exactly what's happening. A very simple example of that is a passive phrase would be the man was bitten by the dog. Perfectly accurate, it tells you what happened, but it's much better to say the dog bit the man. So we've gone from 7 words down to 5, for example, and it's absolutely clear what has happened. So using active as opposed to passive is very important, and you can check your work over for this, or this is something that a critical reader can help you with. And one very good way, as I've already said, to make sure that you use an active voice is to use the first person. So for example, if you've carried out a survey, it's better than saying the survey was carried out, is to say we did the survey, we carried out the survey. It's always better, it's much more specific, and if you say things in a passive voice, not always clear who did it or what is happening. So try to develop an active voice in your writing. Again, I can't go into a great deal of detail about how to do that here. It's something that you have to practice and learn about as you write. So those are 4 of the rules. The 5th one, which is slightly related to the first one, but the 5th one is never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So you can see that's very closely related to the first one of not using metaphors and cliches. And this it's very common in English for people to work in, for example, French words or Latin words. Now occasionally they are very commonly used and are very precise. But often, to be absolutely frank, people often don't know what these mean. They think they know what they mean. So you do run the danger, if you work in foreign phrases into your work, of people laughing at you because you've used it wrongly. You may look rather stupid, and that's the last thing you want to do when you're writing. So try not to use, I think the simplest way to get this across is try not to use words about the meaning of which you're not very familiar with. Try and use simple words. And that even applies to scientific words and to jargon. And jargon, the definition of jargon is language that is understood by a very small group of people. And of course, as nurses, we're very good at using jargon. Nurses and doctors talk in jargon all the time that patients often can't understand. You shouldn't do that, because someone outside your field should be able to understand your article, and it's especially the case if you're writing it for the general public. So try to avoid technical phrases. If you can't avoid a technical phrase, make absolutely sure that you explain what it means. So those are the 5 rules for effective writing as given to us by George Orwell, and he was a very effective and very, very successful writer. And just before I finish, I'm going to read them all again, just so that you're clear. 1, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. 2, never use a long word where a short one will do. 3, if it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. 4, never use the passive where you can use the active. And the 5th one is never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And on the web page that I'm looking on at the moment, it's also got a 6th rule, which is basically don't break any of those rules, otherwise your writing will be ineffective and poor. So that's a very brief look at George Orwell's 5 Rules for Effective Writing. They are taken from a much bigger essay on writing English, which is very, very helpful and easy to find on the internet if you are interested in looking at the 5 rules, and if you're interested in looking further into what George Orwell had to say about writing. I hope you found that useful, and as ever, thank you very much for listening.